Yalimdad and welcome everyone. My name is Sabba Dosani and I will be moderating today's field series exploring careers in neuroscience. A little bit more about me. I am currently a student at Texas A&M University studying to hopefully become a nurse. I am also the College Station representative for AKEB. The Fields of the Future Speaker Series is hosted by Aga Khan Education Board with the aim of exploring career paths, innovation, and opportunities in selected fields of the future. As for today's edition, we will begin by reflecting on knowledge society and the purpose of education in Islam. At this time, I would like to invite Noreen Nanji, our Fields of the Future team member, to share this reflection.
Yalimat, everyone, and welcome to the Neuroscience episode of Fields of the Future series. My name is Noreen Nanji, and I currently serve as a team member for the Fields of the Future Aga Khan Education Board for the United States. So before we begin our event, I would like to kind of just refresh the Jamaat's memory about the Knowledge Society and the purpose of education in Islam. Aga Khan highlights the purpose of continued learning at the Aga Khan Academy, Mozambique on June 25th, 2004, in which he said, in the Islamic tradition, they viewed the discovery of knowledge as a way to understand, so as to serve better God's creation, to apply knowledge and reason to build society and shape human aspirations. It was the Aga Khan Academy, Maputo, Mozambique, June 25th, 2004. So how does understanding the purpose of knowledge discovery help us understand knowledge society? It tells us what the two critical attributes are of true knowledge society leaders. The first, to discover new knowledge, which is related to the purpose of understanding God's creation. The second is to share and apply new knowledge, which is related to the second purpose of serving God's creation. Hazir Imam at the Aga Khan University Convocation Address on 6 December 2006 explains that these attributes will be of the utmost importance in the future. And I want to quote here, all of these changes suggest that we are moving into a new approach of history, a new condition of human life. Many observers decide this new world as the knowledge society, contrasting it with industrial societies or agricultural societies of the past. In this new era, the predominant source of influence will stem from information, intelligence, and insight, rather than physical power or natural resources. The knowledge society will confront people everywhere with new challenges and new opportunities. End quote. Now, some of us may be wondering, does this purpose and these attributes match what the rest of the world thinks about knowledge society? And according to the definition outlined by the United Nations, UNESCO, knowledge societies have capabilities to identify, produce, process, transform, disseminate, and use information to build and apply knowledge for human development. This definition matches what our beloved prophets and imams have taught us for centuries, what underwrites the ability to contribute to knowledge society. Hazir Imam has said in the Kyrgyz Republic, and I quote, "There's no better investment that individuals, parents, and a nation can make than the investment in education of the highest possible quality," unquote. Education of the highest possible quality can benefit us in so many ways. It allows us to acquire the newest knowledge. It provides students with a competitive advantage within global societies. It prepares us for leadership in knowledge society. It provides us the fundamental skills which allow us to participate in the fields of the future and transition between careers. Therefore, I would like to encourage all the students of our Jamaat to aim for education of the highest possible quality, because as there is no better investment than education. And lastly, I would like to thank all the students of the Jamaat who have attended the series and these events would not have been successful without your participation and support and engagement. And I'd also like this opportunity to thank our team and our partners for all of their hard work in organizing these events in this long series of Fields of the Future. And now I'd like to hand it to Shawna to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Shawna.
Thank you, Noreen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Now that we have an introductory understanding of some of the relevant concepts, let's meet our speaker for today. Dr. Faisal Karmali is lab co-director and assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. He combines neuroscience and biomedical engineering to understand how the brain knows how we are moving relative to the world. This process, called spatial orientation, is critical for survival, and errors in this process results in falls in older adults, vertigo, and aviation accidents. Dr. Karmali's research program bridges basic science, clinical care, spaceflight, and aviation. Dr. Karmali's research is funded by the National Institutes of Health, NASA, and the Office of Naval Research. Dr. Karmali received his bachelor's in engineering at the University of Waterloo and Ph.D. in biomedical engineering at Johns Hopkins University. He also plays the role of honorary secretary of AKEB. Before we begin, I would like to encourage our audience to ask questions throughout the session. You can do that by using the Q&A feature of Zoom and entering your question there. The upvote feature is enabled, so if you have the same question as someone else, please like it and it will raise to the top of the Q&A box. Our team will be noting the questions to be asked during the Q&A session towards the end. The recording of this session, along with the presentation, will be shared on our website, fieldsofthefuture.com. And now, without further ado, our speaker, Professor Karmali, will tell us about his career path, new opportunities within his field, and how this field will evolve in the future. With that, I would like to hand it off to Professor Karmali.
Thank you, Saba. Can you hear me? Right. Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. I'm thankful to the organizers for the opportunity to speak to you today. We're here to talk about neuroscience. Let's start with a simple explanation. The photo on the top left is a human brain. Like the rest of our body, it's made of cells. And the most important kind of cells in the brain are called neurons. These neurons act like small wires that carry information. The human brain has about 86 billion neurons. These neurons are also connected to each other at a place called a synapse. The human brain has about 125 trillion synapses. In addition to what's inside the brain, we also have neurons that run around our body. And these are shown in the picture at the bottom, which was made by a Muslim scientist in 1488. The fundamental question of neuroscience is how these neurons and synapses work together to create the amazing behaviors that humans perform. For example, this person is walking on a tightrope and they're continually battling gravity. They need to use their senses to determine how their body is moving and use that information to control their muscles so that they stay balanced on the wire. They need to do this quickly and with very, very little error. Another amazing ability of the brain is to create music. Some of you may have had the opportunity to watch musicians spontaneously create music, as Yo-Yo Ma likes to do. This requires memory, muscle control, and practice. It requires awareness of what others in the group are going to do. It requires the ability to read their facial expressions, hear their instruments, and make predictions about what they are going to do next. It also requires the ability to take the perspective of the audience and make predictions about what will inspire them. And it requires all of this to happen simultaneously. Another amazing ability of the human brain is to do scientific research, to learn more about Allah's creation. This includes research to discover more about how the brain works. Neuroscience is the study of how we get from these lumps of neurons and other cells to the amazing behaviors which the brain is capable of doing. It's also the study of how very small changes in the composition or the function of the brain can cause struggles such as mental health disorders. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about my journey, just because it may be helpful to see some of the junctures that happened along the way. Part of the journey may not obviously connect to neuroscience, but we thought it was important to show that career path because career paths are nonlinear. These pictures illustrate some of the early building blocks that make me what I am today. The first picture shows that I am an engineer at heart. I always loved tinkering, problem solving, math, electronics, and programming. I was always fascinated by space exploration. When I was a teenager, I saw a TV special about the recruitment of new astronauts. Seeing them and hearing their stories made me realize that they weren't that different from any of us, and that if they could do it and be part of the space program, so could we. Reading together was my rocket fuel. It's Mother's Day, so I want to thank my mother for sharing with us her love of reading and for modeling perseverance as she pursued her own career. I have fond memories of the four of us sitting in the library, each reading our own book, even as teenagers. I don't want my father to feel left out, so I also want to acknowledge the adventurer mindset that he shared with me. Finally, the science fair played a huge role in where I am today. I learned to apply knowledge and skills from the classroom to real-world problems. I learned problem solving and public speaking skills. I had the opportunity to travel, expenses paid, to the National Science Fair. These were adventures with other students. I also experienced my first major failure, which was an important life experience. Over the next few slides, I'd like to share some experiences and reflections of how I got from these beginnings to working as a neuroscientist. However, I also want to point out that if you ask my colleagues what I do, you might get a different answer. Some of them might say that I'm a space physiologist. Some of them might say I'm a biomedical engineer. I also have a role as a manager and a leader in my organization. In my opinion, this is one of the fundamental features of the fields of the future, that we develop a set of skills and knowledge that cross traditional boundaries and apply those skills in our own unique way. So I did a bachelor's in engineering at the University of Waterloo, which is sometimes called the MIT of Canada because of its expertise in engineering. The program was unique in that it was a co-op program. This meant that every student in engineering was required to do work experience during their degree. So they would alternate between one semester of coursework and one semester of internship. And so by the time we graduated, we had 6 internships and a total of 2 years of work experience. For 2 of my co-op terms, I had the opportunity to work at the Canadian Space Agency on a model of a robot that is now on the space station. When I started undergrad, I was interested in applying engineering to develop devices for clinical problems. But during undergrad, I became particularly curious in developing devices for the brain. One summer, I found a researcher who was studying brain-computer interfaces. This is a solution for people who are completely paralyzed. For example, people with Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS. And the idea is that, if they can't even move a finger or an arm, they can't move their mouth, it's really hard for them to communicate and control their environment. And so these devices work by recording electrical activity in the brain that's created by neurons. In some cases, metal electrodes are placed on the surface of the head to record electrical activity. And in other cases, small electrodes are actually implanted inside the brain. The hope is that by thinking different thoughts, it will change the electrical activity in our brain. And if the electrodes can pick up that activity, a computer can determine which thoughts you might be thinking broadly. I emailed the researcher and called them a few times. After a few non-responses, the person finally responded. And I believe his decision to hire me may have been partly because of my perseverance. In the lab, I worked on applications to control the home environment using this brain-computer interface, as well as making computer games. So for example, people could turn on, turn off the lights by thinking different thoughts. One thing the team had learned was that this device and this brain-computer interface was good at telling apart two thoughts. So for example, you could think left or right. But trying to tell apart more than two thoughts was difficult. And even with all the innovation and new technology and new algorithms that have happened since the time I was working there, we're still not doing much better at being able to really separate. And if you think about, if you can only tell apart two thoughts, you're very limited in what you can do on the computer. Basically, you can tell the mouse to move right or click, and that's it. So this led me to an important realization that our ability to develop technology to help people was sometimes limited by our fundamental understanding of the brain. And that if we wanted to develop tools to improve quality of life, we needed more basic science research. I also wanted to mention one other experience that was important for me, which is that I did a study abroad in Singapore. And that was an amazing experience too, that I recommend to all undergrads. So during undergrad, I also, based on my interest in the brain, I did this cognitive sciences option. And one of the ideas I was exposed to is this framework about who studies the brain and the mind. So, you see engineers, computer programmers. These are people who are typically developing tools to image the brain. So MRI machines, EEG machines, which measure electrical activity. And these are constantly improving. There's computer scientists and mathematicians. Some of these people are developing computer simulations of how neurons in the brain work together to create the behaviors that we have. There's philosophers who study the brain. They look at how people think and problem solve and look at the meaning of life. Psychologists tend to look at the behavior of a person without, quote unquote, opening the hood. So if a person experiences certain things, how do they respond in terms of their perception and their muscle control? And then biologists tend to look at the pieces of the brain. So how do the cells work together? How do the cells function individually? And so to really understand the brain, all of these people are going to have to work together. It's such a complex problem that no individual field is going to be able to solve how the brain really works. It's going to take a collaboration across all of these individuals. And there's even others that aren't even shown here, but educators, people who think about behavioral science and how we learn, linguists, people who study language. There's so many different folks who are involved. And how does this translate into careers? Here's just the sampling of careers, and there's a link here with a longer list of careers. So, people who study the brain, many of them are in academic research, so they work at universities. There's also people in industry research. So many pharmaceutical companies are developing treatments for different disorders, which require neuroscientists. There's individuals involved in teaching, and this is at all levels, whether it's K-12, undergraduate level, PhD level. There's clinical jobs that are related to neuroscience. So neurologists, neurosurgeons, psychiatry, ear, nose, and throat, psychologists, all of these individuals are involved in studying and treating disorders of the brain. There's something called a neuroeconomist who looks at economics from the perspective of how people think. There's behavioral scientists, even marketing consultants who use knowledge of the brain to study how people respond to marketing, and media consultants who know about neuroscience and will consult to the media using their knowledge of the brain. Okay, so by the time I finished undergrad, I knew that I wanted to do basic science research in neuroscience. And I decided I wanted to do a PhD. In a PhD, there is coursework, but most time is spent as a research assistant, gaining practical experience working on a research program with a mentor. I had a choice between applying to neuroscience programs and biomedical engineering programs. I chose biomedical engineering just because I thought I would be more competitive. Either one actually lets you do the same research. You know, about half the people in my biomedical engineering program were actually doing neuroscience research using quantitative approaches from engineering to study the brain. And so the decision wasn't about what kind of research I would do, it was a decision of which way I thought I would be more competitive in grad school admissions. I wanted to say that for those thinking about this type of path, it's very important to have research experience during undergrad or sometimes even earlier. Those schools are really looking to see that you understand what you're getting into. The PhD is a major commitment, both from the student's perspective and from it's a major financial investment by the university in each student. And so they want to make sure that students are ready for the long haul, that they're passionate about the field they're entering, that they know what to expect when they get there. And so having that research experience is a way of making sure that they do. So I applied to 5 universities and then 1 safety school. I got into the safety school. Out of the 5, I was interviewed at 2 and admitted at 1. And so my message for you is that, you know, not getting admitted is not failure. It's good to stretch. And in the end, you just need to get admitted to 1 institution. Okay. So I started my PhD in biomedical engineering at Johns Hopkins University. You know, a few notable items. I took a neuroscience class in my first year. And one thing I noticed was that the women and men who were teaching those classes were coming to us and telling us about neuroscience that had just been discovered in their research lab, you know, days ago. And when I compared this to undergrad, when I took neuroscience classes, we were learning knowledge from a textbook, and that textbook was based on knowledge that had been published in journal articles, and each of those steps takes years. And so the knowledge we were learning in undergrad was years old. The knowledge we were learning in grad school was days old. And so, you know, when I think about the importance of quality universities and highly ranked universities, a few things come to mind, and one is access to knowledge. So I went, you know, I needed to find a lab to work in and a researcher to work in. And so I went to the chair of our department and I said, you know, I'm passionate about neuroscience and I'm passionate about space. Do you have any suggestions of what I could do? And he told me, oh, there's this researcher named Mark Shellhammer, and he studies the effects of zero-G on the body and specifically of the brain. And so I ended up doing my PhD in this lab. And, when people go into space, 50 to 80% of them will get motion sick when they arrive in space. Even people who have a strong stomach on Earth will still get motion sick in space. When they're in space, they get disorientation, vertigo. Most of these things adapt, and after about 3 days, they no longer have these issues. When they come back to Earth, many of them actually, their brains have forgotten how to walk. And so you see this astronaut in the picture on the left. And, astronauts are people who are very high functioning, right? They're athletic, they do triathlons, that some are Olympians. But this person has somebody holding him as he exits the spacecraft because his brain is actually forgotten. But again, after about 3 days, people get better. And so our goal in our research was to study that process of adaptation and see if we could figure out ways to speed it up. During that time, we wanted to do research on the effects of zero-G. And some people think there might be like a zero-G room at NASA where they magically take gravity away, but actually gravity is always with us. The way people study the effects of zero-G on the body is using an airplane. And NASA has an airplane that's sometimes nicknamed the Vomit Comet, and it falls about 10,000 feet in 25 seconds. And that free fall creates, simulates weightlessness. It creates an environment of weightlessness. And so during grad school, I flew on this airplane multiple times, doing experiments on how eye movements changed, how our ability to determine our spatial orientation changed because of weightlessness, and also how people adapted to this new environment. It's difficult for scientists to present their research at conferences, and so I had that opportunity. And at one of the conferences, there happened to be an astronaut there named Dave Williams. And after the meeting, I went to talk to him, and he said, if you want to be an astronaut, you need to do a few things. He said, you need to excel in your career, learn to fly, learn to scuba dive, and learn Russian. And so after you told me that, I set my sights on doing those things. So soon after finishing grad school, the Canadian Astronaut Program opened recruitment for the first time in decades, and they were looking for 2 astronauts. I was very excited about it. They started with a pool of 5,000 applications. Out of those, they invited 1,000 to submit essays and other documentation. Out of that 1,000, they went to the next cut of 120. And that was as far as I got, because in that cut of 120, there was a medical questionnaire, and because of a small medical issue, I was taken out of the selection. And so that was devastating, a little bit heartbreaking, but I also have no regrets. The journey alone made it worth it. I did the things that Dave Williams told me to do, and these were amazing life experiences for me. So these are just some of the pictures. The astronauts, they do training in northern Canada, doing backcountry camping to prepare themselves for extreme environments. And so I did that multiple times with my friends. That's a picture of me flying a plane around the Statue of Liberty. And that's a picture of me on the Hopkins cycling team, which I did to bolster my physical fitness. Okay, So let me tell you about the job I'm in now. By the time I finished grad school, I had developed a sense of wonder about nature and a desire for discovery. And so I joined this research lab at Harvard Medical School. First, I was in a position called a postdoctoral research fellow. That's someone who's, post their doctorate degree, but they're still a trainee. So they're still there to learn more, to become a better scientist, a better researcher, and they still are mentored. Eventually, I became an assistant professor, and now I'm also co-director of the lab. In our lab, we study spatial orientation and balance. So, something you can try is if you take a pen and try and balance it on your hand. I'm sure everyone's tried this. It's a very difficult task. It's eventually that pen is going to fall down. That's actually what our brain is continuously doing with our body when we're standing and walking and running. We're this tall, long object supported at the base, and our brain has to constantly control our muscles so that we don't fall down. And it does this through, part of the process is called spatial orientation, and that's the process of determining how our body is moving through space. So we do this using different organs. So obviously our visual system, our eyes tell us how we're moving. We use touch, so sense in our muscles and on the bottom of our feet tells us how we're moving. And then also organs called the vestibular organs, which are located inside the ear. Some people call them the balance organs. But those organs tell us information about how we're rotating and accelerating through space. So my initial focus was on both basic science and clinical applications. So I had this shift from a focus on aerospace to a focus on clinic. Part of my research program is to develop computational models of how the brain processes information from the senses. So whether it's the visual system or the vestibular system. And then part of my research program is to do human experiments to study how the brain combines sensory information and uses it to keep us balanced. And this is particularly important as people get older because catastrophic falls increase dramatically as people age. And they're a major public health problem. And anything we can do to understand these processes and then develop tools, therapeutics to improve them can really improve quality of life. More recently, my research program has started to include spaceflight applications again. So, I just wanted to point out that, I'm doing basic science, clinical applications, spaceflight applications, and engineering, which is actually where I started out as a kid. So when I look back, I see these intertwined threads as I progressed through my career. What I didn't see was that, sometimes we think that we have to answer this question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And that there should only be one answer. My experience is that it's okay to have multiple answers. It's okay to be doing multiple things at the same time. And it's also expected that those things will shift as we progress through our careers. Okay, so others in this series have talked about careers in industry, in pharma. So I'm going to focus on my experience in academic research. Professors have a certain reputation, what you might think of when you see this individual, maybe being stodgy, stale, thinking about things that have no relevance to real life. I'd like to think that that's not what we're like. I hope not. When I look at the positions at my institution, I think there's some similarities to working in a startup. So just like the head of a startup is consistently pitching their ideas to raise money, we're also constantly writing research proposals to fund our research program. And so you can think of these research proposals as our business plan. Those proposals go either to government agencies or to industry sponsors. Just like with startups, the funding is competitive and those agencies want to support research that is most likely to support or to solve important problems. Our salary actually comes from those research grants. So in our position, there's no tenure and no guarantee of salary. So if we're not bringing in the research funding, then that's the end of our lab, just like with a startup. On the other hand, just like with the startup, we have a lot of freedom to choose what we want to do. So we have that intellectual freedom. Also, like in a startup, we have to be jack of all trades. So my month usually consists of writing proposals, writing articles for publication, describing new findings, new scientific and clinical and aerospace findings. It also includes being in the lab fixing equipment. It includes designing new experiments and new research. It includes informal teaching, so working with trainees in the lab to develop them into scientists. What our roles don't include much of is formal teaching. So unlike some other academic jobs, we don't do a lot of teaching. So, I'd ask the question, are we entrepreneurial in these positions? I think to some degree, the answer may be yes. Okay, so I wanted to read a couple quotes that touch on some ideas that I think are important. Maulana Haji Imam said, scientific pursuits, philosophic inquiry, and artistic endeavor are all seen as the response of the faithful to the recurring call of the Quran to ponder the creation as a way to understand Allah's benevolent majesty. Is not a great work of art, like the ecstasy of the mystic, a gesture of the spirit, a stirring of the soul? And then another quote from Dr. Salam, who was the first Pakistani to win the Nobel Prize. The Holy Quran enjoins us to reflect on the verities of Allah's created laws of nature. However, that our generation has been privileged to glimpse a part of his design is a bounty and a grace for which I render thanks with a humble heart. And I think those of us who do have the opportunity to do basic science research feel that it's an extreme privilege. Many of us feel it's part of our spiritual search. And I just wanted to point out, I think discovery and innovation are sometimes confounded. I think both are very important, but for me, discovery has a special role in my life. I also want to say that after all these years, I still think that I'm a better engineer than scientist, but I do science because of this thrill of discovery. Okay, so I tried to list out some of the skills that are important for my work. Critical thinking is obviously very important in research. Having a strong core in math and what engineers call control systems is critical. Problem solving. My lifelong learning includes unexpected skills, and one of them is writing. I think I had an idea that once I finished high school, I had finished learning how to write. What I didn't realize that even now, at 35, 40, I'm still learning how to write better. And not just improving grammar, but also, just picking the right word, constructing sentences in exactly the right way to cater to the audience. Statistics and data science are very important for what we do. Creativity, negotiation. we have to talk to those around us to negotiate funding, supports, space in our buildings. Computer programming is very important. Persuasion is also critical. So scientific articles are presenting data, but they're also telling a story and trying to convince someone about that your perspective is the right perspective. I think empathy, perspective taking, so the ability to understand how your audience might be thinking about your work to make sure they're understanding your work. And then I think intellectual humility is a part of any research endeavor. You can go for years without discovering anything. And then when you're graced with a discovery, it's a very humbling experience. Okay, so the future outlook for neuroscience, I think it's a huge growth area. I think there's two major drivers, aging and technology. There's been major improvements and progress in biomedical research generally, and treatment for cardiovascular disease, cancer, other ailments of the body. These are all improving day by day. We still have a ways to go, but those are becoming less. People are able to live longer because of improvements in those treatments. But what it means is that disorders of the brain are now becoming more prevalent because people are living longer. And so there's a dire need to understand how the brain works so that we can improve treatments for different brain disorders in aging. I think technology is also an amazing driver. So for example, imaging, and imaging is a general term that means all of our abilities to record what's going on inside the brain and how the brain is functioning. So that includes, for example, MRI and fMRI. Computation, so our computers are getting faster and faster, and that means we can do simulations of more and more complex models of the brain. And so you remember there's those 125 trillion synapses in the brain. No computer is capable of simulating something that complex yet. But as we get more computation, we can work on bigger and bigger parts of the problem. And then CRISPR. So CRISPR, I think we've talked about it in a past Fields of the Future session, but it's the ability to change the genes inside a cell so that those cells function differently. And so this has increased our ability to study different disorders, treat different disorders. And some people refer to the brain as the last frontier, both because of its complexity and because there's still so much we need to learn. Okay, so I just wanted to summarize some of my reflections from my experiences along the way. So I think one is reading together as a family was my rocket fuel, both fiction and nonfiction. Extracurriculars pushed me to apply what I learned at school. Not being admitted isn't a failure. You only need to get admitted in one place. Attending top-ranked universities provided me with access to the newest knowledge, to unique internships and leading research. So for example, the internship I had at the Canadian Space Agency, I know that they were recruiting particularly at my university. And so that opportunity may not have been available to me if I had gone elsewhere. It is a privilege to have the opportunity to do basic science research and discover new aspects of Allah's creation. Another reflection is that the adventure alone was worth it. And so, I didn't achieve all of my goals, but that didn't mean I regretted the path that I took. Success in STEM careers required me to have both STEM and non-STEM skills. So you saw in that list of skills, some of them were math, computation, programming, Some of them were persuasion, writing, community, public speaking. And so I think this is very important that I'm very passionate about STEM careers. It's great to be passionate about STEM careers, but that does not mean that one should only focus on STEM skills. It's just as important to have those non-STEM skills. Another reflection is this question of what do you want to be when you grow up? I think it should have more than one answer, and it should change with time. My lifelong learning includes unexpected skills like writing. I didn't think I would still be learning writing at this time. Mentors were critical in my journey. So there were many individuals who reviewed materials for me, whether it was university applications, grant applications. I think I could have leaned on these people more. I think people were willing and able to help, and I was shy about asking. I think I could also listen to them more. So sometimes people gave me advice that was opposite of what I was thinking, maybe opposite of what I was hoping to hear. And in the end, they were sometimes right. And so I wish I had had the strength to be able to listen to them when they gave me that advice. And then finally, one practical neuroscience tip, which is when you have a difficult task to accomplish, set aside a treat, whether it's a chocolate or something else, to reward yourself with, and make sure the reward comes immediately after you finish the difficult task. Okay, so just in terms of learning more, there's a couple of links about careers in neuroscience. The BRAIN Initiative, which is a massive initiative by the federal government to support research in the neurosciences. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Professor Karmali, thank you so much for sharing your field of the future with us today. I genuinely enjoyed hearing about how widespread this field is with so many opportunities. With that, I will open the floor to questions. As I mentioned earlier, you may submit questions using the Q&A feature. We did have a couple of questions during the presentation, so I'll go ahead and start with this one. Our first question is, do you have any suggestions for someone who is seeking a PhD who already has a professional's master's degree, but no research experience? Do you have any advice on where to start to gain some research experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have people in our institution in the lab they take on a job that's called a technician, a research technician. A research assistant would be a better term. So these are people who already have a degree, perhaps more than one degree, and they come to the lab. 2 years would be a good amount of time. And they work in the lab doing research. And then their goal would be during that time to learn to do research, learn a field, publish some papers in peer-reviewed journals, and then use that as the basis for their application. And I think 2 years may seem like a long time, but I would see it as an investment. Those 2 years could actually shorten the PhD, because some of the development that would happen during the PhD will happen during that research technician time.
Thank you so much for that. We have a more specific question here. What were your critical findings on the effects of zero-G on the body?
Yeah, so we were studying a reflex called the vestibular ocular reflex. And so if you look at a piece of paper and shake your head, every time your head moves, your brain actually moves your eyes in the opposite direction to keep them pointed at the same place in space. And that relies on this sense of motion from our inner ear. And that sense of motion senses both rotation of our head and tilt of gravity. When you take gravity away, that reflex started to function incorrectly, and the eyes would move too little. And so that could result in blurry vision. But what there were two important findings. One was that if people went and flew on that airplane 3 days in a row, by the third day, the size of the errors were tiny compared to on the first day. So the brain was adapting. A second important result was that if you brought someone back a year later, initially they would have those errors, but the errors would go away much more quickly. And we could actually, the brain actually remembered a program specific to that environment. And so that showed the importance of training in 0G if you're going into 0G.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for that. Another question here. Someone asked, what mathematical logarithms do you use in your computer simulation? Do you use calculus, numerical simulation, etc.?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last sentence.
Yeah, no problem. They asked, do you use the neural networks, calculus, or numerical simulation?
Okay. So it's mostly numerical simulations. I've worked a little bit with neural networks, but yeah.
Thank you. We have a more broad question, I guess. What advice would you give to middle school students who are entering high school in terms of courses that they should take if they want to have a career in neuroscience?
My experience is that for as long as possible, we should focus on building a general foundation for the future. And I took biology, chemistry, and physics, calculus, but also English and social studies. So I think that would be my answer is if you have the option not to specialize at this point. I think all that knowledge will be beneficial to you in the future.
That's nice. Thank you. And adding on to like more classes and the path to take, someone asked if you have a liberal arts degree, what would you recommend doing to enter this field? Any tips or anything like that?
So I think I think you saw the framework of all the different people involved in neuroscience research and studying the brain. And so, folks with a liberal arts degree fit right in the middle of many of those. So I think in terms of knowledge, there would be a lot of areas where you'd be a good fit. Psychology, philosophy, linguistics. I think the key would be also to have the research experience if you're looking to do a Ph.D. Or whatever other relevant experience if you're looking, for example, for a clinical path.
Awesome. Thank you. It's nice to know that even with such a different degree, you can still, connect it somehow. That's nice to know.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just a nice to have either. It's like those folks are critical to cracking the mysteries of the brain.
Right.
Yeah, biologists are not going to do it on their own.
Let's see here. I had a question over here. Is there a way to connect neuroscience to global health, specifically focusing on mental health?
Oh, interesting. I think the primary tie-in is in the more clinical side of neuroscience, where people who are doing neurology, psychology, psychiatry would be the folks who have a strong understanding of the brain and the disorders of the brain and their treatments, and can deploy programming to improve global public health. I think the research being done in those fields will eventually trickle down, but I think public health is usually interested in the more immediate needs. I think the one area where researchers might be able to contribute is in solutions that are more efficient. So if drugs or treatments are too expensive for a global context, maybe there could be discoveries and innovation that provide solutions that would work in more context.
Thank you. Here's a question for you specifically. What is the latest neuroscience question that you're pondering upon? And are you thinking about finding ways to answer that specific question?
Yeah, so what I'm particularly interested in right now is that no part of our brain is perfect. And so when our vestibular system or our visual system senses how we're moving, there's errors in those signals. And the brain receives these signals with errors. And one question is how those errors impact our behaviors. And so, for example, we've got techniques now where we can measure what the errors are in how well we sense tilt of our body relative to gravity. And we know that those are correlated with how well people do in a balance test. Another problem I'm working on is that these errors arise in all parts of our brain. So what we call the sensory side, the central side, where the processing that goes on in the brain, and then on the motor side. So when the commands go out of our body. And so if someone's making these errors, can we develop tools to figure out exactly where the errors are coming from? Because the treatments are different depending on where the errors are coming from. And so those are two of the areas that I'm working on. Those actually, I mentioned that we've been able to measure these errors and show that they cause more errors in balance. We also do studies where people are doing a piloting-like task. So they're on a chair, it's motorized, so it's constantly tilting them, and they have a joystick, and their goal is to keep themselves upright. And we look at how well people can do this task, and people who have smaller errors in their sensory organs also have smaller errors in their ability to pilot. And when we did some back of the envelope calculations, we found that if you took people who are quote unquote healthy and you found the people with the largest sensory errors out of that healthy group, they would be have a 5% chance of crashing a lunar lander. Whereas the people with the lowest sensory errors would have a 0.001% chance of crashing a lunar lander. And so this is an issue that NASA is not currently looking at, but we're pushing them to look at this area.
It's a very interesting question, and I'm sure you'll figure it out, and best of luck to that. We have a couple of people here that are wondering, what is the reason to learn Russian to be an astronaut?
That's a great question. So the International Space Station, I think it's about 20 years old, and it's an international collaboration, but the two biggest partners are the United States and Russia. And so the majority of the astronauts on the space station are either American or Russian. And at least until recently, between the time when the space shuttle stopped flying and the time when SpaceX started flying humans, all the Americans who were going to the space station were traveling on Russian vehicles. And so for all of those reasons, it was important to learn Russian.
That's awesome. I think learning a new language is something everyone should look into. So that's really cool that you
It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Taking that Russian class is very frustrating because I had all these classmates who were liberal arts majors learning 6 languages at the same time. and I could barely remember a few words of Russian, but I passed.
I can imagine. We have another question here from a neuroscience graduate. They're asking if you could share more of work and life balance, graduate school, and your career in academia.
Okay. Well, okay. So work-life balance now. You know, what's worked for me is I've set my boundaries. I've decided that I am going to have a major role in my kid's life, and if that means that I, don't get as far in my career, then that's what it's going to be. So, the pandemic obviously was challenging to my career because I was spending a lot of time with my kids, and I got the opportunity to be their teacher for a lot of the last year. It did push back my career, but I have no regrets about that. So I think you set the boundaries and make it happen. I think I don't want to downplay the importance of work-life balance. I know it's hard, but I think being very strategic and hyper-focused in choosing what we do with our lives can help. So it's easy to get distracted and take on tasks at work or at home that maybe are not that important. And so I think if we're thoughtful about what we work on, it can help with that work-life balance. In terms of work-life balance in graduate school, I don't think graduate school is a place where there typically is work-life balance. I think university tends to be an all-in experience. But I did have a colleague who started graduate school as a parent, and she was able to make it work. And in hindsight, I think she was hyper-focused, and I think that's what benefited her.
Thank you so much for sharing. And we have a couple of people wondering if you could elaborate more about machine learning and neuroscience.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. This is one I ponder often, and I've been wondering what role machine learning should play in my research program. I think as a tool to process data, I think it's incredibly important. I think in terms of diagnoses of disorders, processing MRI images, I think machine learning is going to play a critical role. What I haven't cracked yet is what's the role of machine learning in discovery, besides as a technical tool. So once we use machine learning to process our data, and maybe it lets us process more complex data sets, how do we use it to lead to fundamental discoveries? And that's what I'm still wondering about. But I think as a tool, both clinically and experimentally, I think machine learning is going to play a big role.
Thank you so much for that. We have another question here. How familiar are you with data analytics and neural network profession?
So, yeah, so in terms of data analysis, we do quite a bit of data analysis. We have data sets where, we might record the eyes over a long period of time, and we have time series data of how the eye is moving with respect to time, or how the body is moving, or in a piloting task, how the chair is moving with respect to time. And so we need to develop analyses for those. Sometimes we're using control systems approaches from engineering, where we're looking at high pass filters, low pass filters, Fourier and Laplace analyses. But all these tools to like extract the fundamental features of the data. Then once we've done that, there's usually statistics involved. So generalized linear models, ANOVAs, those kinds of data analyses. In terms of neural networks, it's funny, I think the last time I used a neural network was in 2001, so 20 years ago. And I haven't found a use for it in my particular research program since then. I feel like there should be a role, but I just haven't found that role yet.
Thank you. Let's see here. We have a couple of more questions. So since you do a lot of work with clinical implications, did you ever consider pursuing
Sorry, what did pursuing what? It cut out when.
an MD? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've considered it many times. I think there are people who have a PhD and an MD. I think it's a very powerful combination. But I decided it wasn't for me. There were some parts of medicine that really I struggled with. I'm not good at remembering long lists of words and names and drug names, and so that's one reason it just wasn't of interest to me. But I will say I have a colleague I work closely with who's an MD and a neurologist, and I think our partnership is amazing. So I think we complement each other. We both bring different perspectives to the table. So I think I know enough biology and I know enough about clinical medicine to be able to interact with an MD. And I think that's exactly where I want to be.
That's nice that you can learn from your colleagues and still work together.
Mm-hmm.
That's very nice. Someone here asked, do you know if any of these jobs are in need of high demand?
I mean, from my perspective, they're extremely high demand, and I think the demand will be sustained. Maybe it'll require a bit of agility because the focus within that broad framework may change over time. Some jobs may be more in demand than others, but I think the complexity of the problem means that it's not something that AI is going to automate anytime soon. I think the breadth of the problem means that no matter what area someone is interested in, they can play a role.
Thank you. And we have a couple of more questions here. Someone asked, whenever you are working or experimenting, doing research, I'm sure you encounter a lot of roadblocks or problems and such. How do you approach that as you discover new knowledge and everything?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there was this Ismaili professor in my JK growing up, and one time I told him that I've been working on this problem for a long time and I'm getting frustrated. And he told me that in research, It's like you have these long stretches of nothing, and then suddenly you have a discovery, and you have to like savor that moment when the discovery comes. I, I think it's good to evaluate whether that's a fit for your personality, because sometimes uh, sometimes there are periods that can be drawn out and perhaps even frustrating. So being able to recognize that there will be ups and downs, and to try and ride out the downs and savor the ups.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. But thank you for sharing that as well. Let's see.
I mean, one thing that does, as you get more senior, you're usually overseeing multiple projects, and so then it kind of averages out. Like the project, you'll have some that are up, some that are down, but that's unfortunate for the students and the trainees and the less senior folks, because they're working on one particular project, and but I guess there's a light in the end of the tunnel as you move up.
Yes, we're all still reaching for that light. Okay, we have a question here. A breathing method developed by former Soviet space scientist, and I'm probably saying this name incorrectly, Konstantin Butekyo, helped with cosmonauts stay in space significantly longer. Are you aware of any of this research done on the use of breathing methods or patterns to improve human potential in space programs?
No. I was just thinking.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm definitely gonna look it up after, but I'm not familiar with that.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question here. You spoke basic science. How do you personally view the significance of basic science as to applied science?
Yeah, so I think basics, applied science is very important, because that is how we'll improve global quality of life. And as your mom has emphasized that, I think practically the applied science rests on a foundation of basic science. And often the applied science can't be done without the basic science. But one thing I realized is that sometimes they don't have to be so discrete. Sometimes the basic science and the applied science go together. I think we've had studies in the lab where the results of experiments have had both basic science implications and applied science implications. I think so. That's looking at the external impact. I think in terms of the internal drive, for me, there's something very special about the process of basic science, because we have occasionally we have the privilege of being the first to observe something new about creation, and like that feeling is such a privilege and such a rush. So I think for me that's one of the drivers. But I think that many of the Nobel laureates, they talk about the importance of curiosity-driven research in their statements when they receive the Nobel Prize. They say that they received the Nobel Prize because of some result that helped cure cancers or helped improve some understanding of the brain. But they said that when they started that path towards developing those applied solutions, it was because they were exploring their curiosity. You know, they had observed something new about nature and they wanted to learn more. And so I think it's perhaps a little naive to think that we can only focus on applied science problems. I think both are critical.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And it's always good to think about the privilege we do have to just study anything and from where we started as well, the basics essentially.
Yeah.
And a personal question for you. Favorite quote was that motivates you?
Sorry, it cut out for a sec. What was the question?
Yeah, a more personal question. What was your favorite quote, or what is your favorite quote that motivates you?
Oh, yeah. Well, I can think of two. You know, just in terms of pushing myself, there was one from Mark Barneau, who was the first Canadian astronaut, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think he said, uh, you know, try and do your best, and then see if you can do 10% more. So it's like, you know, you don't want to set your goals too high in terms of what you can output, but like just push to see if you can do a little bit more. And if you do that, you'll be surprised by what you accomplish. I think that's one. And then the other I was thinking about is from Back to the Future. If you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.
That's a very good quote. I've never heard that, but it's
Yeah,
really
you might be a little too young. I just dated myself.
No, but thank you for sharing. That is very interesting to think about. I've never thought about it that way. Well, coming down to our last two questions here. Do you have any advice for switching fields, for example, from the academia to industry careers?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the focus, you know, one of the things we like to think about in the fields of the future is a focus on both fields and skills. And so I think no matter what career you're in, you want to develop broadly your skills. And so that includes both, you know, the quote unquote hard skills like computation, math, whatever, clinical skills if you're a physician, but also the soft skills. So negotiation, persuasion, uh, public speaking. And so I think if one focuses on developing a broad set of skills, many of those are transferable between industries. And so whether that's academia to industry, one industry to another industry, you know, going to a startup, maybe even going back to academia, you know, those are important to think about. And then obviously the importance of networking and developing relationships, because if people are going to hire somebody, they want to make sure that they're going to perform. And if they're doing a transition, there's a little bit more uncertainty for the person hiring. But if there's somebody you can say to them, I know this person, you know, they'll deliver. They won't struggle in the transition. I think that will go a long way.
Thank you for sharing that. And our last question, do you have any parting thoughts or general advice for our audience today?
You know, I think life is a buffet. There's so many opportunities available to us. You know, for the parents, I think it was my parents gave me a lot of independence to explore, but they also continually encouraged us to do our best to take advantage of that buffet. And so yeah, so I think positive support from parents is critical and was critical for us.
I definitely agree. Thank you so much. And with that, we are out of time for questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Faisal.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you all for attending today. I want to remind all of you with the last slide to stay home and save lives. Our institutions encourage you to stay home and continue to practice physical distancing. Before we conclude our program, I would like to complete a brief evaluation to let us know how we can improve our upcoming events. The link is on your screens along with the QR code. Additionally, for easier access, we have shared the link in the chat box. Please take a moment to complete it now. Once again, thank you all for joining us today. I hope to see you at our next event in 2 weeks. Thank you and Yali Madad.